The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Alfie Bown is the author of the PlayStation Dreamworld and Enjoying It, Candy Crush and Capitalism. Along with being a theorist on video game culture, he has recently started writing for The Guardian. He recently wrote a review of Ready Player One entitled Steven Spielberg's film portrays video gamers at their worst, and before that he wrote a think piece for them entitled How Video Games Are Fueling the Rise of the Far Right. It's this second piece that he'll be discussing in this week's episode. It's Wednesday, April 11th, 2018, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast.
Enter World 2. The ninjas have disappeared underwater. Are you still bad enough to dive underwater and save tiny mixtapes? Player 1 ready.
Also, I should say that Matthew McKeever's thought experiment novella entitled Coming From Nothing is available for pre-order from Zero Books. Coming From Nothing is a tragic comic love story concerned with notions of identity, such as Judith Butler's idea that sexual identity isn't determined by the body, and John Locke's idea that personal identity is a question of memory. I want to thank David F., Nicholas M., Bo D., and 253 other patrons of the Inside Zero Books podcast. You are making Zero Books digital content production possible. If you enjoy this podcast, you might consider becoming a patron also. You'll get access to a second podcast every week, including monthly installments of C. Derek Varn's podcasts, Symptomatic Redness, and Alternatives. The music you're listening to right now is from Enmesh's Warp Zone, but in just a moment, you'll be listening to Alfie Bown and I critique video games. You've written this piece. It was a little while ago now, but it was controversial. You wrote it for The Guardian, and it was called How Video Games Are Fueling the Rise of the Far Right. And it was controversial not for the usual reasons. Like, I have people on often enough where people get mad at them for being problematic. They're questioning things that they shouldn't question. In this case, people on the left and the right didn't like being told that their games were problematic. Did writing this piece make you feel for someone like Anita Sarkeesian?
A little bit. I've been kind of getting in some trouble for the piece, and actually for both pieces. I wrote two pieces in The Guardian this month, and they were both about video games, and they both link video games to what I would think of as far right or alt-right discourses and ideas. So a particular kind of online right, not just general right-wing. And I think, people's reactions seemed mostly to be rooted in I enjoy these games and I'm not a right-wing individual. Therefore, you must be mistaken that the game is right-wing. And so, there were various interesting kind of reactions from people. Quite a few of the kind of alt-right Reddit boys tried to kind of trick me by email into sort of saying some embarrassing things that they could quote and ridicule me for. And there were a couple of sort of response pieces from liberals essentially saying, this guy's got it all wrong because I'm a liberal and I love Call of Duty, so Call of Duty must be great. And there were also some really good response pieces as well to it, which made sort of valid criticism. So I'm not just sort of defending my points. I think there were good criticisms to be made, but the interesting stuff came out of the rubbish criticisms that were made, actually, which kind of highlight some of the issues surrounding gaming and how we might need to think about gaming in a different way to the ways which we tend to think about it.
Well, I want to ask you what the best criticisms were, but before I do that, I want to make sure that I understand what the aim of your article was on just the first one on how video games are fueling the rise of the far right. Usually what people like, the kind of criticism that I think people are used to would be the kinds that someone like Tipper Gore launched against rap music or punk music many, many years ago now, back in the 80s.
First of all, that's a very bizarre rendition of what my group is about. We are not right-wing fundamentalists. I happen to be a liberal Democrat. We have two coalitions. Excuse me. Okay, one at a time. It's simply not true. I happen to be a liberal Democrat. I work with Republicans and Democrats on this issue. We have one coalition with the National PTA to advance the idea of record labeling so parents would be alerted when there was graphic material.
I don't know if that helps, though, because I don't know if that helps or hurts, because I think kids, when they see the label, they want it even more.
Okay, so let me finish.
There's something much worse than that, though.
He has leveled a lot of charges. We are also supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Why? Why are parents and teachers and doctors concerned about graphic lyrics in young children? There's a reason for that, and there's a way to deal with that with respect for freedom. We had nothing to do with the problems that you had. We want to educate people that we want to. That was not an accurate quote.
All right, I'll pull it out. Right here.
Have you ever been misquoted by somebody?
What kind of example are you setting for your own children when you lie on national TV?
I am not.
Right here.
Excuse me.
What about Jello Biafra's obscenity trial? Quote, I like to take credit for it.
But it doesn't
mean she said it. Because, believe me, because it's written doesn't mean she said it.
Exactly. You can. That's right. You can be. I've been misquoted, and I'm sure you've been misquoted before. That is really not the issue. The issue is how do we deal with graphic material, lyrics detailing rape, artwork that shows rape that Guns N' Roses had, when it's marketed aggressively to young children at a time when many of them are at risk in our society. There are many kids that are growing up without a lot of adult guidance. There are many kids that have problems. The National Mental Health Association estimates some 14 million children.
And you think the music contributes to more of the problem?
I think the music always sets a tone for a generation.
But
and we have to be aware.
The question, though, Tipper, doesn't the music reflect what's already going on?
The conditions in society, the music reflects what happens. It's not the other way around. It's not. We're not making up anything that's a fantasy, you see. And American society is sick in some very basic ways. You had Don Johnson with Dead Bang, used guns.
Right, yeah, and that really isn't what I'm saying at all. So let me say, I mean, I think obviously the title of the article was not provided by me, but by the editing team, who were probably interested in generating quite a lot of clicks. And so, you know, the title doesn't really do justice to what I've actually tried to say, which is that I mean, and I want to say first of all that, you know, I've said that video games could be conceived as kind of incubating alt-right or far-right discourses in certain ways, but I want to be wrong about that. I think some of the people who reacted badly to the article, they probably assumed I was, a journalist who comments on all kinds of things, who was just kind of weighing in onto the gamers without really thinking it through. Whereas actually the opposite is true. I'm not much of a journalist, but I am much of a gamer. You know, I've been gaming for 20 years plus, and basically my whole adult life and childhood. And I want to be wrong. You know, I want to be wrong about this, and I want it to be a different situation. I don't want to attack gamers and say that games are evil, like those kind of those arguments have been going around probably our the people's mums have been making these arguments about games for a long time. I'm not saying that at all, that games are bad and making people think and do the wrong things. My argument is totally different. It's basically that games are political spaces, whether we think they are or not. There's nothing innocent about gaming. It's always inside ideology. It's always bound up with politics, and therefore, I've written this book, The PlayStation Dreamworld, which is looking to interrogate, if we take this as a starting point, this kind of Žižekian idea that everything is always inside ideology, and video games where you play as a kind of escapism, you feel most free when playing them. They are very powerful ideological sites. And so I've kind of written a book trying to explore, if we accept that, what politics are they serving in predominantly, and could they be used more progressively for the left? So I'm a pro video games person. I think video games are massively transformative and they're here to stay. I'm certainly not saying people shouldn't play them. I'm just saying that at the moment, if we look at what kinds of ideologies are encouraged by gaming, we might be rather disappointed, and we might see the fact that the left is rather absent inside those circles and those games.
You wrote that video games attracted right-wing players because they carried right-wing messages and produced right-wing pleasures. Now, this isn't the same thing as saying that they cause people to become right-wing exactly, but you said they also prepared apolitical gamers for some later embrace of right-wing values. What values are you thinking about particularly when you talk about right-wing values? Right.
Okay. Well, I think one thing is distinguished. I mean, a lot of people have discussed video games in terms of content. And I think one of the things where I suppose I do have a more controversial position is I don't agree with a lot of people who are mostly on the right, I think, who think that video games are liberal and left-wing. People even argue that the general discourse of video games is far left. One of the people who contacted me after the article was some guy who used to be part of IGN, and his sort of email to me was like, well, as we all know, video games predominantly or even entirely support far left ideologies. So how can you say that they are producing right-wing forms of pleasure? Now, I definitely think that's wrong. And as you sort of said before, the Gamergate saga also showed how people think of video games as being kind of left-wing propaganda at times. I mean, I think well, I wouldn't say the opposite is true, but that is far from the truth. And my approach, that argument, I think, could only be sustained on the level of narrative and on the level of content. If you look at the narratives of many video games, they do now increasingly tend towards a kind of liberal storyline. So if you look purely at the content and the narratives of these games, you could easily think, okay, these generally, I wouldn't say there are many left-wing storylines in gaming, but obviously that depends what one means by left. But in general, I think you could sustain the argument that games are liberal if you just look at the narrative. But if you look at the kind of forms of pleasure, and this is why I apply psychoanalysis to video games, if you look at the forms of pleasure and enjoyment which are produced by the games themselves, not just the contents, I'm looking at a much more structural level and on the level of pleasure, then I think you can easily identify major right-leaning trends throughout the history of gaming. So some examples would be kind of the prevalence of things like border policing as a kind of structural...
So I want to get to these comparison of video games in just a second. But before we do, I'll point out one... Well, I've been kicking Chomsky around a little bit, or trying to anyway, in videos that I've made for the Zero Books channel. But one thing that Chomsky said was in a book called Manufacturing Consent, was that in order for the mainstream media to operate as an effective propaganda engine for the state and for the establishment, it had to appear to have a liberal bias. In other words, if everybody in the major mainstream media was liberal and they're already so extreme, then there were very clear boundaries on acceptable thought. Something similar going on with video games?
I think that could be applied in this case. It's actually part of the way the the entire complex industry and culture of gaming functions, that it should appear liberal, whilst in fact being structurally to the right. And that I think is exactly what I argued in the case of Ready Player One, in the other Guardian article, that, you know, at first glance, this is a rebellion film about five young people who, attack the corporate state, and triumph against these kind of awful corporate powerhouse, figures. But if you look closely, you can see that really what we're looking at is a bunch of kind of meme creating Reddit boards, people who are very arrogant in their own kind of Easter egg collection style of kind of gaming. And I argue this piece that the Ready Player One heroes are somehow comparable to the online rights. In the way that they group together with each other based on these kind of incredibly powerful shared references. They encourage people to find like-minded people who have as many Easter eggs and the same Easter eggs as them online, and club together as a tiny sort of cell against the evil corporate state. And this really is the logic of some of the online rights people who are prominent on the kind of Chan boards and Reddit threads. So
yeah, but they're stealing that from the left anyway, the little secret cells. But I want to say something about Ready Player One, though. I'm with you overall about that movie, as you know. But the thing that really, what happened to me while I was watching this movie is that it brought out the accelerationist in me.
Right.
And so much as I wanted to see the corporate villain win, and take over the Oasis and put in all the ads, because it would obviously that would just completely destroy the place if he did that. No one could use the thing anymore, which would be a great benefit to humanity if they were all freed of this machine that made them think that drinking tab or whatever pop cultural reference they could remember from some bygone era made them authentic somehow. So
no, look, I mean that's one of many possible alternative endings that would have been preferable to because what happens is, of course, when they do take over, they make this kind of stupid gesture of like, oh, we're going to close the Oasis on Mondays and Tuesdays or something, but otherwise it continues to run as normal. So it really isn't a kind of film about transformation of corporate social life at all. And of course, the other reason why you wanted that ending is because Ben Mendelsohn is just like the best actor around at the moment.
Right, he's very good in it. Yeah, he was all right. He was the only one who I like to watch in a way.
I love him. Have you watched this program called Bloodline?
No, I need to see that.
Season one is like a perfect piece of art, and he's incredible, and then the rest of it's rubbish. But watch season one of that. It's
all right.
Anyway,
but, a little geeking out there. But no, So I totally agree with you, and it didn't even occur to me until you just mentioned it that the ending of that movie, and spoiler alert, spoilers ahead, is that ending is classic. Chocolate laxative, or basically like Tom's shoes. Buy these shoes and donate to African children. Kind of line. Everything in moderation. The total decadence, but in moderation. It's
exactly.
It's a very Zizekian sort of ending. In other words, I can imagine Zizek endlessly throwing up into his popcorn while watching him.
Terrible. I mean, there's also the possible ending where he accidentally pressed the button and so on to close it all. And yeah, I mean, it was just as you said.
That would have been good.
That would have been a decent. Yeah, that would have been good. Or like anything but what happened. But yeah, I mean, anyway, to get back to the point, I think this isn't far from what we're talking about. I think that this pattern, if it is right, that what looks like a kind of liberal rebellion tale, if one thinks about it a bit more, you can see that it's actually far from being that. I think that does play out, and that's where you could apply the Chomsky quote to video games in general. I think that what we're looking at, and the way to make the division in my book is the kind of the theory which I've tried to use to make the division is to say that on the level of narrative, on the level of content, it looks like this liberal world and so on. But if you think on the level of desire, on the level of pleasures, the kinds of forms of pleasure you can identify are far from liberal, far from left wing. They could be liberal, they could be corporate, or they could be right wing, but they don't seem to be generating, let's say, left wing pleasure. It's hard to kind of qualify.
Yeah, well, I want to know what left wing pleasure is. It makes me think of like a left wing pleasure might be a little underwhelming in a way, because it would be leaving you open for thought, like going to a Brechtian play, or might be a left-wing pleasure.
Right. I mean, this is something else some people have criticised me for, saying, well, if the games were left-wing, they wouldn't be fun. Now, I don't think that's right, and I think that there are some examples of left-wing gaming which I would consider proper left-wing gaming, or which I basically mean by that almost Marxist gaming. I mean, games which actually function to point out the kind of economic structures underlying the experiences we have in the culture wars and in the world of culture. There are a number of games emerging which try to do this, and I think do it well, and I found them to be incredibly fun. So I don't think we should have like art games. Actually last night I was at a great event. It's kind of by some artists who have they've used Counter-Strike to like make a real museum, which is based on historical war which took place in Hong Kong, but they've rendered it by creating their own map in CS:GO. So we all go into I was like hosting this event last night and doing Q&A for them, and it's just fascinating guys who have like taken a piece of technology like Counter-Strike, which is completely to the to the kind of, in terms of its values, we could just strip it down to like American foreign policy, and it's 15 years old, and it at least emerged as kind of pro-American imperialism game. You just shoot Arabs, but they've used that completely against the grain, created a really unusual map in it, and you still run around, but you're kind of confronted with the reality of war and so on in a much more left-wing way, but it's still incredibly fun. I mean, if people are interested, they can just check out this online autosave readout, it's called. It's a brilliant project. And then there's so many other games like Nova Alia and Post-Capitalism, which I've been talking about recently, both of which I think are left-wing games and even Marxist games, and they're not, there's no absence of fun there. I mean, so I don't think we should make highbrow games like theatre and Brechtian games per se, but I think there are other ways in which we could see, and we are seeing games emerging on the left which don't lack those kind of enjoyment at all.
Well, I just want to throw out there that the Stanley Parable, which is an older game now, I think of it as almost a Brechtian approach to video games, but it's very much enjoyable. Yeah, it is enjoyable. Yeah. So you can even do that, I guess, in an enjoyable way.
Yeah, and one can also think about that, and whether my whole point would be applicable. Is also sometimes the case that the enjoyment might be one type of pleasure and the actual content might be another type, and those are interesting differences between video gaming and other forms of media, I think, where you can kind of play with those relationships. But let's talk about a few games maybe which could help to explain the idea. I have a
list here that I wrote down before you called, or before I called you, and what I did was I put them. I just took some games that I could think of and I put them next to each other, and like, which side is it a good or a bad game? I put it so like Space Invaders versus Berserk would be the first one.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. This is a great comparison. I mean, I would say in this case, Berserk is a more left-wing game, and Space Invaders much more to the right on the kind of structural level. So it's interesting. I think this example oddly points to what I've kind of been saying, that on the level of content, they're like more or less similar, right? They come out from roughly the same time, like they're around like late 70s, 78, 80. And, Berserk is Alien Invasion, and so is Space Invaders. They both go towards the kind of robotic aliens as well as the kind of Well, in Space Invaders, you got a little bit more of the sort of natural alien, haven't you? The sort of
it's hard to tell what those are. But they're either weird aliens coming down, or those are their ships.
Well, I think when I was younger, I thought they were the ships, but then when I played it again, I played it in this one of these kind of arcade, these kind of hipster arcade, like barcade with the craft beers. And
there's one here.
And I thought,
it's called Ground Control here. What's it called where you went?
The one in New York I went to was called Barcade.
Okay.
And it's I thought then these are little alien figures. They're actually little kind of, one of them has got like octopus legs and that. Anyway, I think that, so on the level of content it looks similar. But if you think about the actual anxieties produced by the games, the kinds of pleasure likely to produce, I mean, in Berserk, it's quite different. Space Invaders, you think about the layout of the screen, you're at the bottom, right? You do not want those objects, those aliens to pass down towards what is essentially your border, which is the kind of imaginary line. You've even got some kind of structures there which kind of protect your border. So this Space Invaders is probably the classic example of like this kind of border control game, which is a massive trend from tower defense games have all followed this line. Lots of other kinds of games are about kind of border policing and border control. And I think that Space Invaders not difficult to say that it reflects some of the Japanese fears of immigrants in the 1970s and desire to protect and police the border at that time. And I think the pleasure it produces is this kind of anxiety, of a kind of defensive anxiety, where the alien or the other is approaching and your role is to hold them off and so on. Berserk, it's completely different because your character is the alien essentially. It's like you've landed. I can't remember if there's much of a storyline at the beginning, but you find yourself in a kind of robot world where you're moving through all these rooms, right? And the robots are surrounding you, and you're kind of defending yourself. And it's a much more kind of odd kind of anxiety and pleasure. If anything, it's the reverse of Space Invaders, where instead of being the one with the borders to defend, you're the infiltrator, but you're not infiltrating for a kind of colonization mission. You're just kind of being treated like a kind of horrible outsider. Do you remember the recordings of the voice in Berserk?
Fight like a robot.
You told me that the first time that you could actually hear
a voice
talk.
I think that's right. It's certainly one of the earliest. Like you said, I think you had lots of noises in other video games. Even Space Invaders does have noise, right? But but not words. Whereas Berserk was one of the first time. And those intruders say things like, the humanoid must be captured, and calls you a chicken and stuff like that. And it's quite scary and frightening. And I think on the level of the sort of structure of the pleasure, it's much more anxiety inducing. It puts you in the position of the alien who's being persecuted by the kind of powerful land controlling robots, rather than putting you in the position of powerful border control agents fighting against the evil thing. So even though the content is similar, I think that on the level of pleasure we can say that Berserk has a kind of left-leaning production of pleasure, and Space Invaders has a kind of right-leaning anti-immigration production of pleasure.
So now I've got a couple more comparisons for you. The Sims versus Animal Crossing.
Okay, that's very interesting. I've got a lot to say about glad you mentioned Animal Crossing. I've got a lot to say about games like that. I'd say that we could call them community building games, and also compare that, add to those farming simulators like Stardew Valley, which was really big in 2016, very recent farming simulator. And I think what's right wing about these is the kind of idolization of natural serenity and so on. It's nostalgic representation of pastoral serenity from the old days, and this is a huge pattern in gaming. A very clear example of when what immediately looks like a kind of liberal critique of capitalism turns out to be a horrible celebration of natural harmony in the pastoral past, which in fact is much more like the logic of right-wing political discourse than it is of anyone on the left.
What do you think of something like Happy Wheels or Super Meat Boy?
Oh, Super Meat Boy, I like that. Yeah, why do you ask that?
Well, Super Meat Boy is incredibly violent, and so is Happy Wheels. Have you ever played Happy Wheels?
I've had a very brief go. Is it good?
It's not good in any sense. I mean, it's sort of repetitive. It's an online game. It's not, it's like a flash game or something. But you can be a dad on a bicycle with your kid strapped on the back on a little bike seat, riding through an obstacle course with like knives flying at you and falling down, and inevitably your kid on the bicycle seat is beheaded or or ground into bits, and you are too. Eventually, you get your bones break, and you can keep going after one leg breaks, but after both of them are broken, you're done. Or
I think those games are much better for our society than like those liberal games or those liberal-looking games that we talked about earlier, which are secretly endorsing on some level right-wing structures and right-wing pleasures. Like, I mean, those I think are the problem. I mean, I don't think that Happy Wheels is doing any damage, even though it's like horrendously violent, perhaps, or Super Meat Boy or something like that. I think the worst kind of games are those ones which seem like, they're left-leaning or liberal, but actually on some other level they kind of endorse kind of pleasures and structures which are to the right. I'd say they're the problem. The ones which just look like horrendous violence, they are, and that isn't ideologically dangerous, And I think that one last thing I'd like to say is that games from the left perspective. I mean, I really would like to see more. I mean, games have to be more than woke if they're going to be a force for the left. I think. There are lots of woke games. And because of the political history of gaming, because of gaming cultures, and because of like all that's been happening already, I think if games are going to work for the left, they need to be more than just woke. I mean, I guess I'm seeing games emerge. I think I didn't mention this game Papers, Please. I just make a quick mention of it.
Okay.
You basically work as a kind of border patrol agent. You just stamp passports. That's the whole game. And you have to decide whether to let people in. You work for a kind of Eastern European country with a horrible nationalist agenda who doesn't want to let immigrants in. And you have to decide whether to let these poor people through your gates or not. But the game shows you how that your economic conditions, like how much you've been paid, whether your family are starving, will lead to cultural prejudices. So if you're like, yeah, I'm going to reject this guy's passport and send this foreigner out of my country, I'm not letting this foreigner in, then the game then shows you that those discourses are the result of economic underlying conditions. So basically, the game is structured so that the more good you do, the less you're paid by this kind of horrible state. So eventually, you, the gamer, start to be like, yeah, get out. I need this money for my family, so I'm just get out of my country, you foreigner. But the game is deliberately trying to show you how economic conditions will lead to those kinds of racial discourses. So it is kind of Marxist in that way, and it's more than woke. And I think that if games are, I do think left-wing games are emerging, and more are going to emerge. So I don't think it's like hopeless. But I think, we can't simply say, oh, well, look, in Watch Dogs, you play as this kind of awesome hacker, so therefore it's left wing. Or what did someone write about my article? There's a game where you kill Nazis and you can't get more left wing than that. I mean, I mean, that's utterly stupid, isn't it? But also it does point to people's view about games that, well, if you're killing Nazis, but how the hell is that left wing? I mean, only if you think about it in the most superficial way. And I think what I tried to do is think about the underlying structures and pleasures of the game, not those kind of superficial approaches.
I have to mention Grand Theft Auto now, because Grand Theft Auto, which we've talked about before when we tried to record this before, but I found myself when I was playing it doing usually just very antisocial, sort of sociopathic things as a character. And you've heard,
but say again about what you and your son were doing.
I would. Okay, I'll play it with my 15-year-old son. He's got it on his computer, and I was just following non-playing characters around, often enough, usually women. I would just follow non-playing women characters and to see how long I could keep them in my sight. And I would talk to them the whole time. Hey, what are you doing? Where are you going? That kind of thing. And they would, wander away. And because what would happen if you let them leave your line of sight, they just cease existing. They cease to exist. You have to keep up with them if you want them to stick around as entities in this world. And I also wanted to know what the program would do with these characters if I didn't just walk past them, if I kept with them. And I liked watching them repeat patterns as well. Often enough, they would catch on that I was following, and they would just run and run and run forever. I'd also then, after a while, if they did that for too long and tried my patience, I would have to kill them. So yeah, it was a bad thing. And I realized as I was playing it this way that there was maybe possibly a streak of misogyny in this. You tell me. What do you
Well, I think obviously there is. But here's the thing. I wasn't saying. A lot of people thought I was kind of saying, well, you shouldn't play these nasty games. Of course, these games are misogynistic and patriarchal, and they are also nationalists, and they are also any number of other kind of ideological positions which we would associate with the right. Of course they are, or at least with, if people want to query that, at least with ideological positions which we don't want to endorse. But I'm not saying, therefore, one mustn't ever play these things. In fact, if games are dominated by these trends, it points us to the prevalence of these kinds of pleasures in our social life. And I don't think here's where identity politics won't work on this issue, because it's not the case that, I don't enjoy it and therefore I'm not one of it. In fact, those moments like you describe confront you with the fact that you are able to experience those forms of pleasure which you in fact consider to be awful. You might not be able to. You might only be able to experience them via the kind of displaced character. You probably wouldn't enjoy Doug doing that in the streets.
No, well, I mean, it's not just that. I mean, I do things like just get up on top of a building and shoot random passersby to see if how many I can kill before the cops show up. I mean, that's not that's an antisocial kind of behavior. That's it made me actually, I've played Grand Theft Auto now for a number of times for years and years. So like the first time I ever played the game, I think I was in my 20s. I think, I'm in my late 40s now. I think the game's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
It may have been early 30s, but in any case, that was the first time I became a school shooter. Was when I was with that, because I wasn't really a school shooter, but I was up on a roof just shooting people down in the park. Yeah. And I did that for about 30 minutes, and then I felt like, who am I?
Well, look, here's my answer, and I think this really does get to the heart of the issue of all the different positions. I mean, let's just use GTA as the example and think about those positions that people took on video games, right? That people initially says, like, oh God, people are going to replicate this violence in real life, right? Now that has been like pretty much disproven as a position. Like, if you do it on GTA, that doesn't mean you're going to go and commit violence in real life, okay? But still, that was a dominant position on video games, and I think some people mistakenly thought I was just kind of replicating that old argument. But the second argument that came along, probably in the 90s, but it was kind of reappeared in the last few years. Actually, there have been even some scientific studies which kind of quote unquote prove this, that like games actually provide an outlet for frustrations or desires which already exist in the individual, and which actually therefore games kind of prevent school shootings. It's got sort of the reverse argument, like because you did that in GTA, right, that's why you're not following a woman around the street or shooting people from a rooftop in real life. This argument is also rubbish. And the problem with the two arguments, and this is why I think I've made an argument in my book which is solid, and so far people haven't sort of, the criticisms I've had haven't actually, I think, been able to get rid of the argument or debunk it, is that both of these positions, which characterize the history of thinking about video games, they see the desire as already existing first, and the game as somehow relating to that pre-existing desire. So, either so, like that second position, you want to be misogynist and violent, but you can't in society because we don't allow those things, and therefore you get to do it in the game, and that might actually prevent you doing it in real life. The problem is that the games actually make those desires possible in the first place, and have a much more dialectical relationship between like what people want and people's desires, people's impulses, and the games they play. It's not that the games simply respond to what we already want. Either so people who think games are wish fulfillment, they already think that the desire already existed, and then so on, and then the game sort of allows you to experience it. I think it's much more complicated than that. That games have a dialectical relationship with desire. Yes, they respond to what we already want. Right? That's why you can see a dialectical relationship between games and politics. Games reflect the kinds of politics which are circulating in our societies. They also reflect the kinds of desires that we have. But they don't only reflect those things. They're also part of a kind of dialectical process by which desires and emotions, affects, empathies are transformed. And that makes games much more powerful than a lot of people are willing to admit. And that's where they can be sort of, I say, dangerous ideological tools. But, I'm not saying we shouldn't use them or play them. I'm just saying we have to recognize that they're political and they are powerful enough to influence desire, empathies, affects, emotions. And if we accept that position and we think that in general they're leaning towards the right, then I think we see a dangerous and concerning situation for the left when it comes to gaming.
What do you think Theodor Adorno's favorite video game would be, or what would he say about video games overall?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is one of the things I'm not I much prefer Roland Barthes to Adorno, simply because, I really like mythologies and Roland Barthes' work in general. But there's a lot that I don't agree with. But one thing I love is that he always is analyzing enjoyments that he's experienced, and that he enjoys. So it's so funny that he had this kind of odd passion for amateur wrestling, for example, and then wrote a kind of convincing critique of the kind of enjoyment found in amateur wrestling. That is much better than Adorno's position, which seems to be I'm going to slag off what other people enjoy. I want to be really clear that one has to experience the enjoyment in order to think about it. And so I wouldn't be saying these things if I wasn't a passionate gamer. It goes back to what you said about your experience of GTA as well. It's important to put yourself if video games have the power, for example, to put yourself in the seat of someone else's enjoyments, that's very interesting. And it's important to do that, and also to kind of reflect on it. I would take a kind of anti-Adorno stance, I think, to video games, and say that, we shouldn't be not playing them. But we need to realize their implication in politics, experience their enjoyments, and also kind of think about the kind of relationship between those pleasures and the political moments that they arise from and that they inform. Recording, yeah.
I'm recording.
Yeah, so just when we were talking about, when you asked me about things like Super Meat Boy, the super violent games, saying that those games are not as ideologically problematic as some of those apparently woke games that we might have also discussed. I think that, why is that the case? Is a really important point that the left, I think, really suffers at the moment from people who think it's kind of strong and prominent, when actually it's not the left that people are seeing when they're looking at those things. It's actually a kind of woke liberalism. So, people on the right think that the left is sort of powerful and needs combating, but actually what they're looking at and what they think is left-wing is actually kind of this kind of woke liberalism that you see. And so, it also explains why you get the backlash when you say, oh, there are no left-wing games, because people think there are loads, but actually it isn't what I think you and I would agree on is the real left, isn't represented there. And the left kind of suffers from this kind of appearance that it's strong and prominent when actually it isn't. So that's why I think those games which, pretend to be or look at first glance like some kind of progressive ideology, but actually aren't, are more dangerous than, the actual games which are just kind of pure violence like Super Meat Boy or even Hotline Miami or something like that.
Here I thought I was going to get through a whole podcast without poking the identity politics woke liberal left with a stick, and you call back after the call's over. So just to make sure we do it.
But I think I felt that we'd made the point, but not explained why. Why it's a problem for the left that opinion is there.
Right, I'll tack this on the end. Alfie.
Okay.